My name is Beth Johnson, and as Heidi said, I'm an origami artist. I live right here in Ann Arbor. Wow, those bright lights are kind of bright. And I am really excited to be here today because I do so much with origami all around the world. I travel all around the world. It's a very international art, very well-connected community around the world doing origami. But I don't really do much here in Ann Arbor, which is a little unfortunate and something that I'd like to do more of. So I was thrilled when they contacted me to come today and talk, and I'd like to thank them for including me and thank all of you for being here today. And so I'll start with a little bit of a confession. I'm always a little uncomfortable when I tell people that I'm an origami artist because I'm never quite sure what they're thinking when they hear the word origami. Almost invariably, I hear one of two responses. Either my child or grandson or the neighbor boy or some young person that I know loves origami. Or I once learned how to fold a crane when I was in school. In fact, I think I've heard that a couple times since I've been here. And I don't take offense to it. I know people are trying to connect with me about my work. But what it suggests to me is that when people hear the word origami, they tend to think of a child's craft, something that kids enjoy but eventually outgrow. And it's so much more than that. And hopefully today I can demonstrate some of that too. So this child's craft, for about 500 years, that's exactly what it was. A way for parents to make toys for their children. Until the 1950s, when a man named Akira Yoshizawa saw the potential for paper as a creative medium. This one man is solely responsible for the birth of modern origami. He took origami and elevated it from a craft to an art. And he not only created tens of thousands of new designs, but he also, maybe more importantly, created this system of diagramming that we're still using today, this way for us to share instructions with one another, and which was essential for its growth as an art. Matt was talking earlier about the free is the new black, and that is what origami is like. We all share our work with one another freely. It's almost the cultural norm that when you create a design, you share it with somebody else. You teach it at conventions. You post the instructions for free online. So it's really unique and interesting in that way. It's such a social art, and we're all sharing everything we know, and that's how we're learning, and that's how it's been able to grow so rapidly. Since Yoshizawa, it's literally exploded overnight. In terms of the complexity of the models that are being created, in terms of the different styles that we're seeing, and also applications in science and engineering and tech, which relates to what we're talking about here. So just a few examples of what that explosion has looked like. Models went from very simple to very complex in a very short period of time. Those pieces on the right, each one of those figures is folded from a single square sheet of paper without any cuts or glue. That's an artist named Eric Joisel, who's pretty phenomenal. He just passed away a few years ago. Something else that's interesting about origami is that only two of the major players, Yoshizawa and Eric Joisel, have passed away. So all the greats are still alive and actively participating in conventions, and we have access to those people. So that's pretty unique and interesting. We've seen the emergence of a lot of different styles and niches. So something that you might see progress over hundreds of years with different arts is happening almost overnight with origami. And this is an example of what I would call, this is representational work. This is the area that I work in. But this is more what I call highly representational, where you're trying to accurately represent the detail and proportion of the form. That's kind of the goal of this style. And then you have more minimalist work that's really trying to reduce the work down to its essential lines and kind of capture the essence of the figure. Also representational work, much different spin on it. More stylized figures, maybe have a sculptural feel to them. Abstract sculptures, and again, all of these are a single sheet of paper, including that vase on the lower right. That's just one sheet of paper without any cuts.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I'm really curious how big these are.
The vase is probably about this big. These particular pieces right here, all of them in general.
Like in general, are they
those
small or are they?
It just depends. You're kind of limited in the size of the paper that you can find. It's harder to make larger pieces, but those sculptures by Eric Choisel that I showed earlier are probably about that tall. These pieces are each, maybe dinner plate size. I don't know. And then patterns. This is another huge area of origami where you have patterns like tessellations, corrugations, spirals, fractals, curved folds. This is just a small sample. There's all kinds of other niches. Some people just spend all their time folding dollar bills. There's action origami, modular origami, and all of these things. This is all kind of new. More recently, computer modeling and computational origami have allowed for greater complexity and innovation in origami. This is an example of a computer program developed by Robert Lang. It's called Tree Maker. It actually helps you design origami models, which is pretty extraordinary. And the model on the right, the scorpion, is a model that Robert Lang designed using that program. It actually allows you to also do models that are more complex than anything you could do by hand. It's kind of more of a novelty right now, or maybe a tool for prototyping, but it's really cool. And I'm thinking about what that might look like in the future is also really exciting. And all of a sudden, origami is becoming a hot area for research. This ancient art that only requires a single sheet of paper, that ostensibly couldn't be more further removed from the world of technology, is being recognized for this tremendous potential in science and technology. It's being used to help understand how, I don't know if this is kind of small in the back, but Eric Demaney's working on how proteins fold and how galaxies get formed using four-dimensional folding, which is impossible to conceptualize. Robert Lang has helped develop a solar array for space. You want something small that can become big once it's shot out into space. Heart stents for cardiac surgery. The unique properties of folded forms are being used to help inform, create new materials, everything from nanoscale all the way up to large, rigid, foldable structures like this emergency deployable shelter. So there's the solar array. That's just a small prototype that actually did go up into space. It's a very exciting time to be in origami. There's so much opportunity for discovery and innovation, not only in the art itself, but also in these unique applications in science and technology. There's a lot of tension and debate about how to define the art because it's so young. That discussion that happens over centuries in other art forms is happening all at once right now with origami. I travel to conventions, there's origami conventions all over the world, which is something people are always surprised to hear about. I just returned from one in Columbus, actually, this week. And there are people there from Spain and, I don't know, it's a dozen different countries, Australia. People come, and we get together and we fold, and the energy at these events is palpable. Those of us who are in it right now feel like we are in the middle of something very special. It's a really exciting time to be in origami. It's truly unique, and today I'd like to share with you some of the reasons why. Hopefully make some meaningful connections to the work that you do and to this larger theme of creativity. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about my creative process and what drew me to origami and what origami means to me. It's my profession, kind of. I'll talk about that a little bit. But it's also much more than that. It's really my true passion, and I feel incredibly grateful to be able to do what I do. For years, I worked at a desk job that left me really bored and uninspired. And I left that job with my advanced degree and my retirement plan to spend my days folding paper, which is kind of crazy, but I couldn't be happier. I'm having so much fun. So, what is origami? I'm always surprised when some people aren't even really, never even heard the word before. That's really strange, but aren't really sure exactly what the rules are. So, origami, the goal is to transform a single sheet of paper through folding alone, without using any cuts or glue. You cannot add anything to the paper, and you cannot take anything away. You can only transform through folds. And it's this transformative nature of origami that sets it apart from any other art form with a physical medium. In this regard, it is truly unique. There's nothing else out there that's quite like that. So every art form has these inherent constraints related to its medium, and origami is no different, paper. But then we add these additional constraints, these rules, that it's important to note these rules are completely arbitrary. But these rules are what make things interesting. This is where the magic lies, exploring just how far you can transform a sheet of paper through folds alone. It's as much an engineering pursuit as it is an artistic pursuit, this blending of math and art. And it's really like a puzzle. How do I get the paper to do what I want? And there's an incredible amount of satisfaction and fulfillment when you solve that puzzle, when that design comes together in that perfect way, with that perfect blend of technique and aesthetic. And even though it may sound paradoxical or counterintuitive, these constraints are what drive creativity in origami. These constraints create this problem for us to solve, because if we could cut the paper, there would be no problem to solve. So what do these constraints mean in practice? Let's just try a simple exercise. This is kind of challenging without any of these materials in front of you, but just imagine if I gave you a ball of clay or a paintbrush or some paper, some scissors or other art supplies, and asked you to create an elephant. You probably could come up with something with all of those different materials. It might not look good, it might not be artistic per se, but you would intuitively understand what needed to be done if I gave you a ball of clay. And I deliberately included these examples that look like they were made by young children to show this is even a straightforward task for young kids. And obviously the wooden elephant sculpture there is a little different. That does take skill. But at the same time, the difference is that we can intuitively still understand what's been done, or even if we don't have the skills to do it. We see that this artist took a block of wood and carved some wood away, most likely. So we understand what's been done. Now, let's make an origami elephant. So we all have the same problem. We start with this single sheet of paper. And we have the same constraints, no cuts and no glue. And we all start at the same place with that one square sheet of paper. And we end up, when we're done, at the same place with a single sheet of paper. The only thing that's changed is the creases that we chose to put into that paper. So the only tools we really have at our disposal are our knowledge of origami technique, our time, and our creativity. So would you even know where to begin? This would be much easier if you were holding a sheet of paper, but just imagine that you are. How would you begin to manipulate that paper to start forming the elephant's trunk, or forming 4 legs out of that square sheet of paper? And also, how do you make it in proportion or aesthetically pleasing? If we could cut the paper, it would be much easier, but we can't, so this becomes much more difficult. Yet despite these very strict constraints, there are infinite solutions to this problem. And because of that, there's so much room for creativity. So just a sample, I chose this elephant because this is easily the most commonly creative form in origami. There's probably over 700 origami elephant designs out there. And so now that you've seen these examples, thinking back to the last slide that we looked at with the painting of an elephant, et cetera, with those, when we're looking at it, we see what's been done. When you're looking at these, would you intuitively know what you would need to do to recreate that, to replicate that? Probably not. It's not something I can even do. Even if I saw what all the creases were, it might be challenging for me and for most folders. So there's this mystery around origami, a mystery about how models come together, and I hear it all the time when I show my work. People always say, "This is one sheet of paper? How did you do that?" So following instructions is one thing, but coming up with these designs is something totally different, and it can be kind of an intimidating process. So let's see if we can unravel the mystery just a little bit. I'm going to talk very briefly, just to kind of provide some insight into how origami designers create models. So there's really only one decent book on the topic of origami design, and that's just been published. Well, this is a second edition. The first one was published a few years before that, so this is relatively new. There isn't really even instructions or ways for us to learn how to design origami models. So there's this one book. It's called Origami Design Secrets, Mathematical Methods for an Ancient Art, and it's essentially a math textbook. It can be very intimidating for beginning designers, novice designers wanting to start doing this. And the book covers a wide range of topics on all kinds of different design techniques, kind of intimidating names like uniaxial box pleating or polygon packing. But the primary focus of the book is about developing an origami base. An origami base is very important in origami, so I'm going to just talk very briefly about that. An origami base is essentially the rough outline or structure for your model. The idea is that you think about what you're creating. If I'm creating a bird and I think about how many flaps, we call them flaps, I might need to create that bird. A bird has 2 wings, a neck, and a tail, so I might want 4 flaps. So we have this on the top, what's called a traditional bird base. That's been around for centuries. That's what the famous origami crane that everybody's probably learned, that's what that's folded from. And the image on the left with all the flat sheet is what we call a crease pattern. You put all those creases into the paper and you get that collapsed base in the center. And that is your basic structure. And then you might do some shaping to create your form. And on the bottom, we have another example. It's a dwarf by Eric Choisel, that artist that I showed you earlier with those fabulous figures. You've got your crease pattern. Looks a little bit different. Your collapsed base, which is very bland and technical. And this is where an artist breathes life into the model with shaping and a lot of artistry and technique. And this is the finished form. And it's really tiny, probably in the back. It's got a saxophone. That's actually a separate sheet of paper that he put into that. But the dwarf is one piece. So, but this is the idea. Both of these are collapsed bases. And that's the goal. Every designer has kind of their own unique approach. But the great majority, rely on developing these origami bases. And these are 2 different design techniques too. This is what we call box pleating. This is something we would call 22.5-degree geometry. It doesn't really matter that you understand that. The idea is that those are different techniques, different ways to collapse to get to that base, but that goal being to get to that base. And there's many different techniques to achieve that. So let's get back to our origami elephant and think about how an origami artist might approach this. First step is we want to define what we're folding, which we've already done, and the next step is to find out if there's a base, an existing base out there. There's a lot of these traditional bases like the bird base that might get me close. But with these more complex models, that's usually not the case. Then you think about developing your own base and then decide what of those many design techniques might get you the closest to that, or what's the most appropriate for that model. And then you start doing some math and geometry, and you start sketching things out, usually on paper. And if you're really experienced or you've done a base that's similar, you might start sketching out by hand. And then you might eventually come up with something like this. This is the crease pattern for Sipo Mabona's elephant. And again, I don't know how well you can see, but this little piece right here in the front is the trunk. You can see that long trunk. So there's got to be a lot of knowledge of origami technique in order to understand how to allocate that paper, how the paper is going to collapse, a lot of geometry, a lot of math, and a lot of intuition about how paper folds. And now that I've gone through all that, I'm going to say that my process is completely different. And I'll get to that in just a second. First, I want to just briefly describe how I got into origami design, because I've been folding for many years. I only recently just started designing. Whoops, sorry. I've been folding since I was about 10 years old, and I've been folding from books and just copying others' models, following instructions, which the great majority of origami is like that. It's kind of like there's always this analogy, so many analogies between origami and music, like a performer and a composer. You know, there's still artistry in both of those, but I was just content to fold others' models. I didn't really think too much about the process behind the design. And that all changed when I folded my first model from a crease pattern. And folding from a crease pattern, this is a model by Joseph Wu, one of my favorite artists, and my finished fold of his crease pattern. It completely transformed the way I thought about origami and how models come together. And it was really quite a dramatic shift for me. I thought, maybe I could do this. And at the time, I knew nothing about Robert Lang's book. I knew nothing about origami bases. I knew nothing about all these different design techniques. I was completely naive about origami design. But I think that worked greatly in my favor because I wasn't intimidated by the process at all, which I think can be a fairly intimidating process if you're just a newcomer to this. And I wasn't really heavily influenced by what I should be doing. Instead, I just simply started playing with the paper. And the very next week, I designed my first origami model. This is an origami owl that I designed. This is my first design, very representative, actually, of my style, which is kind of interesting right from the start. And I was hooked right away, and the work just poured out of me. I was very prolific that first year and continued to grow as an artist. That was about 6 years ago. And I've since received a great deal of recognition for my work, and I travel all over to conventions, teaching others how to fold my designs and exhibiting my work. And what started as a hobby is turning into kind of a profession. There's a lot of really interesting and exciting opportunities. I'm currently working on a stop-motion animation film, for example. So there's advertising work, there's teaching work, commissions, art shows, etc. It's not the easiest way to make money, but it is a ridiculous amount of fun. It's much more fun than sitting at a desk all day. So my design approach, I described to you this very organized, mathematical, kind of structured approach to origami design, and I prefer to simply sit and play with paper. It's a pretty sharp contrast to that more traditional approach. I don't typically design around origami bases, and I sometimes don't even know what I'm designing when I'm starting to explore with paper. I'm simply just, it's like, I think of it as kind of like doodling or improvisation maybe in music. You're just kind of messing around. And then from that process, I start seeing interesting lines emerge or patterns that might remind me of, for example, the eye for an owl. It's a very immersive process. I really need to block out a lot of time and then get into that flow state, and that is when the ideas come. And I also like to merge different styles and techniques. Obviously, I've been folding for a long time, and there's a lot of experience that I have and technique that I'm drawing from while I'm doing this. So it's not like I didn't know anything about origami, but the process is very organic. And one of my mantras is I always try to remind myself, because it's kind of this inefficient way of just kind of messy way of working, is to trust the process. That if it feels good to me, and if it feels creative to me, that's enough, regardless of the outcome. Sometimes something amazing comes. Sometimes it comes very quickly. I call those my easy wins, like this owl, which came to me in from start to finish in maybe 30 minutes. And other designs might take months. But regardless of that outcome, most of the time I end up just with a pile of scrap paper that nothing comes of that. But if it feels good, then it must be doing something right. That's how I feel. And also love the process. I think I just genuinely enjoy playing with paper, messing around with paper, and I don't think I could be doing this if I didn't. I often hear people say, you must have so much patience. A lot of my patterns have there's a lot of creases that go into some of these patterns I fold. And it has nothing to do with patience. I would not describe myself as a particularly patient person in my big picture life. But with paper, I just love the process. I love the process of folding as much as I love the final outcome. And again, I mentioned this before, blocking out the time. I really feel like that is just the critical piece for me to my creative process. I really need that chunk of time, that solitude, to get immersed into the process. And that's when the ideas come. That's when I feel like my most creative work comes out, by doing that. So I often hear that my work is unique and that I have my own style, and I think a lot of that is because of this kind of non-traditional approach to design, because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing when I got started with this, so I just developed my own approach. And also because I like to merge different styles. So I can therefore come up with different solutions to design problems that might seem a little bit out of the box. And this is a good example of that. This is a sheep I designed, and this is probably my most popular design. This pattern that's on the sheep is called a water-bound tessellation that's been around since the 1950s. And I tried using it as the wool of the sheep's coat. And people responded really strongly to this, which took me by surprise, because for me, I just thought it was kind of an obvious application. And I think the reason that people did respond so strongly to that is because it was an obvious application, and it just had never been done that way. And that's what I like to do. I like to use these simple patterns or these textures and these pleats in new and interesting ways. And these are the kinds of designs that I feel can't come from sketching things out on a sheet of paper. They can't come from plugging numbers into a computer program. For me, this is what comes from playing with paper, from merging these different techniques, exploring with that paper, and just seeing what comes out of the process. So very quickly, here's a few examples of some of my work, and this is very much, all of this is from that process of playing with textures and the design building from there. All of these have some kind of pattern, texture, pleating, corrugations. And these are, again, this is where, for me, where my work feels the most original for me, because they came out of the process that got me to this point. And when I'm not using patterns, I tend towards more minimalist models, abstract lines, and I don't worry at all about the accuracy of proportion, which is such a dominant focus of origami design today. I tend to look towards, so a lot of artists, when they're starting to design, let's say an origami gorilla, they'll look at pictures of gorillas, start trying to get some ideas of proportion and this and this. I tend to look towards sculpture and illustration instead for inspiration when I'm starting to, and some of these are just come from doodling and just happen by chance. I don't worry about, I like to incorporate a lot of different materials in my work. I don't worry about using multiple sheets, which is kind of one of those rules in origami that some people kind of, the strict rule is no cutting. But for me, my sheep is 2 sheets of paper. If it makes sense and it's a meaningful application of that, I don't really have any problem with that. There's a lot of purists in origami that they don't even like to use anything other than a square. So I'm not, and I think, that kind of limits you again. So the really big strict rule is no cutting. And then sometimes I do take a more traditional approach. These are models I've designed using that more straightforward kind of mathematical, organized approach to design. And I think it's important to be knowledgeable about all these other techniques. I love hearing how other people design, trying to increase my, my skill with these kinds of designs, because I think it makes you a stronger artist. It makes you more facile with your art. But I also think it's important to do what works best for you and to trust your own creative process, whatever that may be. And for me, I realize that at the end of the day, that really is that just exploring with the paper in my hand. So very quickly, a little bit about technology. I actually use a lot of technology in my work. I'm one of the first artists, one of the few artists to use machines to help me score paper. I do that a lot since I do a lot of patterns. They're easy to score. I've used software to help me design. I think just one of my models, the acorn there on the top, there's a program that helps you design with curved folds, so I use that. I talked a little bit about Tree Maker. There's another curved fold design program. An Origamizer is amazing. You can upload any three-dimensional file and it will output a crease pattern for you. And it's really hard to see there in the back. That crease pattern is crazy and not any fun to fold, but it's pretty amazing in and of itself. Some artists are uncomfortable also with this technology. For me, I just see them as tools to help us explore and implement different ideas. So why origami? I've always had all these other creative outlets and dabbled all kinds of things and spend a couple years doing this. Origami was like that too. I'd fold for a couple years and then I wouldn't fold for years. I'd come back to it. And until I started designing my own models. And after I started designing my own models, I thought the interest would eventually fade, but it never did. And it's actually only gotten more intense. And I never really thought about why until I started working on this presentation. And I realized that with origami, when I'm designing origami, I feel something different in that process. I feel original. The work is coming from someplace deep inside of me. And the process feels very natural and unforced, which is a big contrast to the other areas that I've worked in, where I've always felt very derivative and like I was copying or replicating what others have done much better than myself. And it wasn't an ease with the process like there is with origami. It's quite a different feeling. And I know that all art is derivative, and I'm certainly drawing from all kinds of places for my work. I'm simply describing the process and how it feels to me, that it feels original for me, that those aha moments when you're working and you're in that zone, and those ideas come from who knows where that feel very special and amazing to me. So with origami, there's this amazing combination of feeling like I'm creating something original and this satisfaction and fulfillment that comes with that challenge that comes with the design process that I just love, that I think that's what draws me in. It draws a lot of origami artists in, is that challenge part of it, that solving that puzzle part. And if the urge to create ever fades, there's so much to keep me engaged in origami. There's this wonderful, well-connected, supportive international community that provides so much richness to my life. I feel like I have this big family all over the world. It's also something that's very unique, and I'm not sure what else is out there like that. And it's endlessly fascinating with its diverse applications in math, science, and engineering, and education, and therapy, and more, all kinds of things. So just this week, I came across this article on Wired magazine online. A freaky anti-rubber is still weirding scientists out. It's an article about a class of materials called auxetics, which have really unique properties that operate in different ways from normal materials. When they get stretched, they get fatter, and when you push on them, they get stronger, in contrast to what most materials are like. And origami is a huge player here. Many of the patterns that I fold are auxetic. And just like this sheep's coat here. If you were to press on the center of that sheep's coat, all of those squares would come towards the center and the paper would get stronger around that point that you're pressing it. And so it's not just a beautiful, beautiful pattern, it's also lending insight in the development of new and interesting materials in engineering. I was actually involved in a research study at the University of Toledo that was looking just at this, with these patterns and and auxetics, and these were engineers working with auxetics who had never seen two-dimensional sheets being folded into three-dimensional forms to create these auxetic patterns. It was really a wonderful merging of art and science. So for me, it's all about having that creativity, that curiosity, and that drive for creative problem solving, that challenge of that puzzle solving. That's what I feel is really at the root of creativity and innovation, whether it's in origami or engineering or whatever you might be working on. So thank you.